Patty Hajdu is the Minister of Indigenous Services, and she joins me now from the foyer of the House of Commons. So, Minister, you just heard the headline numbers there. Unfortunately, they're not going down. You're deeply involved in this. Just how challenging has this wildfire season been for First Nations communities?
It's been an incredible challenge, and it's been a heartbreaking challenge, although I will say that the community leaders that I've spoken to are very, very focused on protecting lives and, to the degree that they can, infrastructure. There's been thousands of people evacuated, still are evacuated, hundreds of homes and many, many community infrastructure sites that have been demolished. So obviously, as leaders are working to support community residents in evacuee circumstances, they're also really struggling with the, I think, looming thought of what comes next.
What is the looming thought of what comes next? What do you think that is for a lot of these communities?
Well, as we've seen in previous environmental or, climate disasters, it's a long journey, actually. And unfortunately, the challenge is some communities are extremely remote. So on top of rebuilding in an urban center where it might even still be difficult to build that many houses at once in terms of coordinating crews and building materials, it gets even more challenging the further away you are from a large center. So if you can think about, for example, shipping building supplies to remote communities, sometimes without adequate road access, or the challenge of bringing in a variety of different experts and crews to do that complex community rebuilding. These are the kinds of scenarios that leaders know are ahead of them, and it is a daunting task.
Most of the focus has been, rightfully so, on Alberta because of the intensity there and where the higher number is. But now there's First Nations in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and the Northwest Territories that have been affected by this. How do those situations compare to what's happening in Alberta?
Well, it's a similar story in some ways, in that when people are evacuated, they're evacuated often without a lot of notice, and oftentimes there's a huge amount of emotional distress and then some practical challenges that evacuees face, and that's where the department steps in to help, actually, in terms of making sure that people have, not just on the psychological, emotional support side, the kinds of supports they need, but also making sure that people who are evacuated, who have left behind medical equipment, sometimes prescriptions that are either running low or not with them, all kinds of different needs that evacuees have. We work really closely with communities, and I will say that under the leadership of our government, thankfully, we reformed the emergency management program. So communities now have a lot more autonomy in how they're going to support their members in evacuation, and also how they're going to protect their communities. So we work really closely with leaders to make sure they have what they need, both from a financial perspective, but also sometimes from a practical perspective, including the provision of experts and health professionals.
How do you provide housing and shelter for people in remote First Nations towns who have to evacuate? Like, not that it's any easier but I'll use the example of Edson, for example, which was asked to evacuate. You can get on the road, you can drive to a nearby town. But if you're a remote, isolated sort of community and you've got to flee, I mean, how do you get them out, and where do people stay?
Yeah, so lots of sometimes air evacuations are involved. I live in Northern Ontario, and unfortunately this is a common occurrence with flooding seasons. So each community has an emergency planning team, and they do that preparation, and oftentimes and increasingly are taking control of their own emergency planning. And so they are able to work either in a regional way or in a local way with community providers. So for example, communities may have contracts with different providers in larger centers to provide that evacuation support. And of course, the department works with each community, both specifically and the various Indigenous emergency management regional organizations that do a lot of that heavy lifting in terms of planning and coordination.
In your old portfolio in Health Canada, the report found, a 2022 report found that Indigenous communities are uniquely at risk from the impacts of climate change because of where they live and how they live. How has that affected the situation and the requests for help that your new department has received on this?
Well, I think it's just an indication that the costs continue to rise for emergency management. You know, each year the Government of Canada budgets a certain amount for emergency management, and I would say that it's one of the budget lines that tends to get overspent, and that's just an indication of just how frequently these climate-related disasters are happening, whether it be flooding that on an ongoing basis communities face with the rising tides, or unpredictable atmospheric flooding that we saw in BC. Hurricane Fiona was another climate event that would have a dramatic effect on First Nations communities, and then of course fire that we're seeing right now. And the reality is many First Nations communities are living in a more remote circumstances, closer to you know, situations where we would see, for example, a higher risk of forest fires, and of course are relying extensively on the land. You know, I will also point out that there is not just climate disasters that the department helps with, but it's also environmental disasters. So as you know, with the leak from Imperial Oil just a few months ago disclosed to Indigenous communities, you know, we are starting to see signs of water contamination, and this is a significant health risk for First Nations who rely on not just the water, but of course all of the wildlife who are consuming that water for their sustenance.
What's the biggest challenge right now, Minister, just as a final point? You know, we've been warned by officials in Alberta, the winds are rising, the temperature is high, there's not a lot of precipitation. What's the biggest need and challenge at the moment for the First Nations communities in this area?
Well, I'd say two things. I think we've got immediate emergency challenges. So it's about coordination of people and making sure that we don't lose one life through this. So that's what I would say leaders are most focused on right now, and the department is working to make sure that people have an evacuation plan, that communities have, as I said, what they need in order to fulfill those emergency plans that they've been working on and have started to implement. The second thing I'd say is just the support of people that are experiencing devastating loss in these circumstances. I mean, when your house burns down, you lose everything. You don't just lose, obviously, all of the things that we take for granted, you know, the equipment that's within the house, but you lose your memories, you lose any kind of memorabilia that you have, and there's been a huge emotional challenge. And I would say people are really worried about what they're going back to. You know, I spoke to a number of chiefs in Alberta last week who told me that not only is this forest intricately connected to their way of life and their well-being, but it's also a form of employment for so many of their members who are heavily involved in the forestry industry. And so what does that mean for the economic resiliency of the community going forward? So lots and lots of fear and anxiety, which means that there's going to be need for supports for the time to come.